everyone. Thank you for tuning in to our third episode of NAMI Coffee Talks, a podcast designed to resemble a tight-knit discussion about mental health and NAMI events while sharing a cup of coffee. I'm your host, Helen Hu, and today I'll be interviewing Cindy McCalmont, who is the pastoral lead at Faithnet. NAMI Faithnet is an interfaith resource network of NAMI members, friends, clergy, and congregations of all faith traditions. Faithnet has numerous tools and resources that help educate and inspire faith communities about mental illness and the vital role spirituality plays in recovery for many people. Without further ado, hi Cindy, I'm so happy to have you here.
Hi Helen, good to see you.
So before we begin, since this podcast is called NAMI Coffee Talks, I was wondering if you wanted to share our coffee mugs and show our listeners.
Yes, I love my mug. This is one of two, a set of two for my two grandchildren, and this one is Julius, and on the back it says the grand loves.
Wonderful.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and mine is just says, Mom, you're amazing. And yeah, so kind of the family theme going on with our mugs here. So after we introduce our mugs, I was thinking we can just dive right into it. Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself and what you do?
Yes, I am a United Methodist minister. I'm a grandmother and a mother, of course. And I am working for NAMI because after I had served churches for 15 years, I developed adult onset anorexia. And went through a long period of recovery. Mm-hmm. And the work that I'm doing now is very much tied to my pastoral experience in knowing that both pastors and congregations are not as prepared as we might be for the onset of mental illness among those in our faith community and those in our larger community.
Mm-hmm. So I find it really inspiring how you took your personal experience and applied it to Faithnet, which is such a unique organization in and of itself, to solve a problem that you recognize and that you can relate to. So speaking about Faithnet, could you tell us a little bit more about the history of Faithnet in general? How has it started? And then like what has changed about Faithnet over the years?
So Faithnet is a NAMI national program. There aren't a lot of NAMI affiliates yet that have such a program because it does take kind of the right complement of people, I think, to get started. But NAMI overall understands the role that spirituality can play in giving people hope and community in their recovery. So NAMI overall is very involved in cultivating relationships with faith communities. In this project for NAMI Santa Clara County, we started about 5 years ago, and we started very simply. We just invited faith leaders to come to the office and have lunch and have a conversation. And part of that was us listening to them about what they were seeing and what kinds of information they needed. And part of it was us really giving faith leaders some tools and some resources that they could utilize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess with those discussions, I find it very interesting because you're talking to people from many different religions. And while many different religions may have different ideologies, as you said in our last conversation, mental health doesn't discriminate, right? So you can use these resources and apply them to many different groups. So I guess I just find it really inspiring because in this day and age, a lot of people view things as categories, right? They view like Christianity versus other religions, or, you know, there's not a lot of conversations between the two religions, whereas something like mental health and what you're doing with Faithnet is really combining all of these different religions and having them discuss with each other and realizing the similarities that we share with each other rather than the differences. So my question is, can you give us like an example of these types of resources that can apply to all different congregations?
Yeah, before I do that, I want to take what you just said and expand on it a little further, because I think it's also enabling us to look at people as whole people. So we are not just from the neck up when we have a mental health challenge, nor are we simply a soul when we are sitting in a congregation on a Sunday. And so I think the real opportunity in this is for all of us to reflect on, as the psalmist said, how we are fearfully and wonderfully made, mind, body, heart, and all together. And then in terms of the unity, the connection between all different faiths, I think most faiths have very similar values of compassion and wanting to reach out to people who especially may need extra support. And so a lot of what we can offer is just suicide prevention training, for example, for people to be able to recognize when somebody is in that kind of distress, or being able to offer de-escalation training. What do you do as a faith leader or as a community of faith if there is somebody in your midst who is showing symptoms and becoming more and more agitated? How do you connect, and how do you de-escalate the situation and get the person the help that they need? The other thing is, as I've talked to faith leaders across the whole spectrum, for almost all of us in our faith training in seminary, we are taught to refer, but I mean, essentially what that means is recognize when you can't deal with the situation, get that person to a professional. But then there's not adequate conversation on what that means to welcome the person back as they are recovering, when they still may be having symptoms, when they just really need that accompaniment. How do you do that? And so that's really true across the board for all faiths.
Yeah. And speaking of that concept, did you ever experience something similar to that when you served as a minister and helped other people?
Oh, absolutely. And this is a nuance to this work that I hold very deeply, because in my 15 years as a pastor, I very much wanted to help people, and encountered people in all kinds of physical and mental distress. But what I realized when I was the one who needed help was that it didn't feel so good to be the helpee. And so part of the conversation that I now have with faith communities is, yes, we want to help, but to do so in such a way that we don't create a hierarchy. And sometimes, even with best intentions, helping is more about feeding our own needs rather than the needs of the other person. And so what we talk about instead is supporting. It is facilitating another person's self-determination, and walking alongside. And critical to that kind of relationship is the assumption that it's not just that I'm going to be with this person so they can change, so they can get better, but rather in this mutual relationship, I too am going to change and get better as the helper. And so really trying to overturn some of the less than ideal understandings of helping that exist.
Yeah, I feel like that's such a deep statement, such a wise statement as well. And it applies to, so many different things, not just like mental health challenges, but even when you're volunteering, when you're talking to different people, it's the idea of supporting one another rather than helping one another, and the dynamics of that. So based on what you just said, I remember you teach a workshop called The Art of Facilitating SelfDetermination. So could you tell our listeners a little bit more about that workshop, how it's structured, and your experiences or others' experiences when you teach it?
So this workshop was developed by a man named Stephen Pocklington, who, when I met Stephen, I actually took the training the first time in San Francisco, and it was, I would have crawled on my hands and knees back and forth between San Jose and San Francisco to take this class. That's how important it was to me, and still is. The mantra for this training is no fixing, no saving, no advising, no setting each other straight. And it really has become not just how I it's become for me not just something that I train other people to do. It has become how I try to live my life, and it's really based on the understanding of relationships happen out of mutual vulnerability. And so again, when somebody is trying to help, if they come in with all the answers, with all the advice, with all what you need to do, there's no vulnerability in that posture. And so creating in the workshop, we work on how to open a sacred space between two people, how to hold that space, and how to listen in such a way that the other person can ultimately hear themselves rather than hear me as the helper trying to make their problems go away. But because honestly, the more anxious we get by what somebody else is telling us, the more likely we are to give advice. It's sitting in this non-anxious kind of way, asking questions that we are deeply curious about and genuinely want to know. That's the kind of conversation that changes people, both people in the relationship.
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting concept. So creating like this sacred space. So for our listeners, if they didn't take this workshop, could you just give like a few different details or a few bullet points on how they can create this sacred space between two people, how they can get to know each other?
Yeah, so first of all, it's being attentive to space. I told you before we started recording today that I really wanted to treat this as a conversation between the two of us.
Yeah.
So putting myself in a place that's quiet to have this conversation, that there's no background noise, there's nothing to distract me. My phone is away. I'm not going to try to text in between, you know. So part of setting up a sacred space is getting rid of distractions. And part of creating a sacred space is creating the intention within ourselves. My intention is to have this conversation with you and focus just on that. Everything else falls away because it's what happens between you and I in the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. And this is just an idea that I thought of right now, but there's a lot of these kind of mentorships or, for example, people who are recovering from drug addictions, they might have sponsors. So how do you believe that that's a good system, and how would you change that system?
Yeah, so I think that, yes, I think 12-step programs are incredibly helpful for people. I think in the 12-step programs, there are the people, and then there is the big book and that wisdom that is there. So in a lot of ways, it's more of a three-way conversation, I would say, even though it's not talked about maybe so much that way. But enormously valuable for people. This is stripping away some layers. And so what I try to do is to simply be present and let happen what happens. And often when we have a conversation, our mind is racing ahead and trying to figure out, okay, what should I say next? Or it's racing back and I'm thinking, oh, that part about the coffee cup at the beginning, that didn't go exactly right. um, but learning how to push those things aside and to just let happen what happens. And there's just a very deep vulnerability and presence that I think can't be sustained for a long period of time. And so living this way, you have to kind of come in and out of it. But when I'm really practicing it, as I'm trying to now, it is just that kind of presence with the other person and letting that be.
Yeah, so it's like embracing like the raw, genuine connections that we can have with people instead of, preparing or outlining, which is a lot of what people do nowadays. And yeah, to be totally transparent with our listeners, like while I'm interviewing you, I'm also thinking about like what is the next question I'm going to ask and all of that. But I think I'm learning as the process goes. I'm learning to kind of adapt to the different things that we talk about and ask questions that are a little bit deeper as well, because once you have like a genuine conversation and you can like take the conversation wherever it goes, you can also go into a lot of deeper topics and connect different ideas as well, which is, yeah, I guess it is very, very beneficial.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I guess we kind of talked about your experience in ministry, and then we talked about the things that you want to change with FaithNet. So do you think that there is a relationship between your ministry and how you developed anorexia, and when did you realize this connection?
So there definitely was a connection, and I think any mental illness is a combination of factors generally. So I think that for me, there was a genetic component, there was a family upbringing component, there was some substance abuse in my family.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of ministry itself, I think there were ultimately two things. One was this longing that I confess I still have for spiritual perfection. This longing to be made perfect in love, and to be able to be with people as that kind of loving presence. For me, it wasn't about a perfect body, but it was about a perfect spirit. And there is much history of that in Christianity. In the Middle Ages, there were so many nuns who developed this, that they called it in Latin anorexia mirabilis, holy anorexia. So that was one dynamic. The other part of ministry that I think really impacted me over time was secondhand trauma, and just being with people. Even in what comes to mind, I had to go one night and tell a college student that his father had just murdered his mother. I was with people as they were dying in the emergency room, with family members when they found a loved one who had been dead for a significant period of time. It was those kinds of experiences that over time just had an impact. And so the two factors, just the level of suffering that I witnessed, and then this desire to be the presence of God in the midst of that, in whatever ways I could.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And as you reflect on your journey, as you reflect on your experience, do you think that you would have changed it in any way? So for example, when you face like secondhand trauma, do you think that how you would have tried to solve that issue would be to just pull yourself away from this situation or develop better coping strategies?
So that's a really good question. I certainly could have developed better coping strategies, but to be honest, I think that there probably wasn't a lot I could do. Certainly, there was a lot of talk in my seminary training and in ongoing continuing education about self-care. But I am the person that I am, and how I engage people, I think there is a positive side to that, and there is a burden side to that. And probably the biggest thing that could have made a difference is if I wasn't in such a large congregation and there weren't so many people, that I could have maybe processed what I needed to process better, and not gotten sick.
Okay, yeah. And for the second part, which was your longing for perfection, are there any things that you tell yourself every day, or some things that you deliberately like changed your mindset about to help you overcome this longing?
I think I did. So Stanford, a number of years ago, launched a program called the Compassion Cultivation Training, and they've since kind of separated out into an independent organization. But I did this Compassion Cultivation Training, and what I gleaned from that was that to have compassion, we are always practicing. And so it's the idea of it being a practice, not living up to an ideal. It helps a lot. So that's probably the biggest change in my thinking is if I have an encounter with somebody and it doesn't go as well as it might have, and I haven't been as present or as loving as I would have wished, I just do tell myself that it's a practice, and try to sit with that.
Yeah. And like, I guess with that is like the realization that we're not perfect at all. And, so yeah, I like that. And just to, I guess, broaden the scope of our conversation a little bit, why do you believe FaithNet is so important to our community?
So I moved to San Jose 13 years ago. And at the point that I moved here, I had only been out of the hospital about 6 months. And I was still very sick and very fragile. And I engaged in the mental health community, first at ACT for Mental Health, later at NAMI, and since then at Recovery Cafe. And I have met enormous numbers of amazing people who have very serious mental illnesses. And so I want all of those people that I have come to know and love and respect so much to have community. And that's one of the hardest things to come by with mental illness, in part because some of the symptoms of illnesses we self-isolate, but also because stigma exists even in the church, and that is true. And so I want to create stigma-free mental health communities so that people can find their spiritual community and have hope, have spiritual practices that enhance their lives, and have people who understand and love them beyond just their immediate families.
Yeah. And you mentioned Recovery Cafe, which I guess is a space to carry that out. Could you tell us a little bit more about what Recovery Cafe is and what you do with it?
Yeah, so Recovery Cafe is a national model. It started in Seattle. There are 22 cafes around the country. The second one to be developed was here in San Jose, and it is a place, an intentional, nurturing environment for people who have experienced mental health challenges, substance use, and or homelessness. And the cafe, it's very much centered around recovery circles. So people come and they are assigned to a circle, and there they just talk about where they are. And the circles are really run much as what we were talking about with the Art of Facilitating Self-Determination, without anybody trying to fix or save or advise, but just listening in such a way. And often the person who is talking is the person who is learning. And so if we can create that kind of listening space, people can hear themselves, and it gets rid of maybe some of the noise so that they can hear what next steps they want to take. So those circles are important, but there are also what's called the School for Recovery, and I sometimes teach a writing class in the School for Recovery. I'm on the board there, and we're still doing work even in the midst of the pandemic. It's a little more challenging, but it's a privilege to be able to provide support to people.
Yeah, for sure. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you're doing it in a virtual format now?
For Faithnet or for Recovery
Or,
Cafe or?
or Recovery Cafe?
Yeah. So part of the big challenge, of course, is the digital divide, that not everyone has
Yeah.
the computer or smartphone to be able to Zoom. Not
Mm.
everybody has internet. So the people that do, we are continuing to do classes. I just had a writing class yesterday, which was amazing, to sit with a group of people and to write from where we are and then to share that. For people who don't, we are taking care packages every week, sometimes to homeless encampments that have food and personal toiletry items, sometimes art projects, just things that people can use, but it's more the contact, that somebody's coming to where I am,
Mhm.
and they're coming with this love and this concern, and that makes a big difference. We're also, tomorrow, we're going to be having a virtual open mic night. And so different members of the cafe have, some of them have been pre-recorded, some will be doing things live. And so there will be readings and music, and it,
That should
we're
be
going to
really
be,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah, I can tell you more. Yeah.
Okay, so for our listeners, that will be June 26th in case this podcast comes out later. But yeah. And then I guess since you talked about what you're doing with Recovery Cafe, how have you adapted to the virtual format for Faithnet? Because part of what you said is like people with mental health illnesses tend to isolate themselves from other people. So I'm sure that, Faithnet has become increasingly important during this time.
Yeah, so a lot of what we are tasked with doing for our grant, and I don't think we've touched on, we received a grant from the County of Santa Clara to do mental health education with faith leaders in 5 different ethnic communities, primarily 5 communities, but it can be more than that. And so we're trying to train faith leaders. At the same time, we are tasked with training behavioral health folks about faith and spirituality. So it's this kind of bi-directional approach, which is so important for getting a person from the community into care and from care back into the community. So these presentations that we were doing in person, now we're doing via Zoom. We just had one earlier today, and I'm on Zoom all the
Yeah.
time. um, but we had one earlier today, and all of our staff, our FaithNet staff, everyone has a lived experience of mental illness. So either there are those of us who have had an illness ourselves, or people who have a loved one with an illness. And a big part of the lunch is having a couple people share their personal story, which is always just very, very powerful.
Mhm.
Because I think when we talk about mental illness in kind of general terms, what we end up with is, I think I understand schizophrenia, I think I understand anorexia. But when we actually hear somebody talk about their lived experience, it kind of shakes the tree a bit, and suddenly our simplistic understandings are challenged, and really it's about seeing the person. I mean, all of this fits together in my mind. It's about seeing the person, being with the person, and the diagnosis is immaterial, because it's about this person who, like every human being, wants to live a life of purpose and meaning and contribute in some way. So how can we enable one another to do that? And for some of us, we need medication, some of us need therapy, but it's simply to get the symptoms so that they are managed in such a way that we can contribute.
And I think by also seeing them as people and sharing their stories, it also reduces the stigma surrounding mental health illnesses because people can recognize that, we're all human and we all face like similar things as well. Um, Okay, so I guess my next question is how does FaithNet reach out to these faith leaders from certain communities, and how do you like attract them to come and get this education and also actually implement this within their congregations?
So a couple of different things. First of all, we have teams, a coordinator and assistant coordinator in each of the ethnic communities, and they are working all along in developing relationships. So they'll cold call a pastor or a church and say, "Hey, um, we just want to talk to you about mental health. How can we be helpful?" So some of it is happening just in developing those relationships. It's also true we've been doing the work long enough now that we, in certain faith communities, there are larger things happening. So in the Lutheran Church, the ELCA, for example, they received a national grant to do mental health education with all of the Lutheran churches
Mm.
in this area. The Catholic diocese is very far along in this work. And so some of it is we've gotten enough traction now that people come to us and say, let's expand this, let's do more. Or they are sending people to us saying, we've started this mental health ministry in our parish. You should go to this training and contact the FaithNet staff, and you can, get yours started as well.
Okay, so it's kind of like word of mouth marketing, and yeah, kind of like these congregations like know about NAMI. Okay, so yeah, that's a nice way. So I saw that on your website you had the Faith Leaders COVID-19 Toolbox. Could you explain a little bit more about that and also how people can apply that if they are a faith leader?
Yeah, so early on when we started sheltering in place, in the faith leaders that I know, people were just so terribly stressed, both in terms of just trying to take care of all the needs in their parishes, but also trying to figure out how are we going to worship and how are we going to do this. And so what we tried to do at that point was to back off of, we're calling to talk to you about mental health, but more we want to help you and your mental health as you're responsible for so many things. So we began to develop resources that we thought would be helpful for pastors. And the NAMI Warm Line, Sarah especially, it's just so amazing at gathering these things together and putting them together in such a way that people can find what they need. So whether somebody is looking for information about housing resources in the midst of the pandemic, or whether somebody is trying to learn more about anxiety and how to manage that so that they can talk to people. The other thing that we did was we developed something we called Ask Them for Their Wisdom. And we gave all of our staff an opportunity to write about coping skills that they had learned through their experience of mental illness. And so that we could then share that with faith leaders to share with their congregations. And what I really liked about this was it turned things on its head. Going back to that helping idea, we always assume that we are the ones to help people with mental health issues. But as the pandemic hit, what we saw was people who had an experience with mental health issues actually had coping skills that were in place that enabled them to ride the wave of this even better than other people who maybe hadn't had to really deal with their mental health. And so the people, those of us with mental health conditions, became the wise ones who had something to offer. So that link is also there with the COVID resources.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's like everything that we've been talking about this entire podcast kind of really coming to life through and a real life example. And also, like something like this pandemic, it really isolates people, right? Like everybody has to stay in their houses, but then at the same time, you find everybody is actually coming together and helping each other. So yeah, like I guess tough times just bring us together, and something good can come out of every single experience. So since our conversation has come full circle, I was wondering if you could give just one thing that people could take away from this podcast.
So there is a quote, and this is from Stephen Pocklington, the man that I mentioned, who first trained me in the art of facilitating self-determination. And this is a quote that I return to again and again, and that is that human beings aren't problems to be solved, they're mysteries to be honored.
That's wonderful. Claps for virtual snaps for that. So yeah, I guess that really summarizes what we've talked about in our podcast. And if you're interested in Faithnet, or if you know of a faith leader, which includes anyone who is in a place of leadership in your congregation, please encourage them to check out Faithnet. Faithnet has plenty of resources for them. Even if you just want to start the conversation between your church or any congregation, any faith community regarding mental health, you can visit their website to learn more, and you can invite or refer your faith leaders to Faithnet so they can learn more as well. And once again, to all of our listeners, please make sure to subscribe to this channel. You can check out our podcast on our Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or even on our social media. We have Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter, in which you can get regular updates from us about the upcoming NAMI walks, upcoming fundraisers, important events, including Faithnet events, as well as upcoming podcasts that we present to you guys. So thank you so much. And thank you, Cindy, so much for being on this podcast. I'm sure we all learned a lot from you.
Thank you, Helen. I've enjoyed being with you.
One last thing to all of our listeners, we want to say
cheers.